There is a pretty short list of movies that can alter the quality of my day, not because they're bad and I'm upset that I watched them, but because they're just really upsetting. The 2024 film The Coffee Table is absolutely one that I would add onto that list. Oftentimes with movies that you'll find on the list of the most disturbing things I've ever watched, you're gonna find things that rely really heavily on being super graphic or pummeling you over and over with horrible subject matter, and they'll often rely on the visual of something horrific to hit the notes that they want to. The thing about The Coffee Table is that it doesn't do any of that. There is very little in the way of graphic material in this movie, but it's one of the most difficult things I have ever sat through. My dog was just standing at the door of the studio looking at the bunny rabbit in a very not way that I want way. I don't want her to eat the bunny rabbit, man. This movie lasers in on forcing you to sit in the aftermath of something horrible that happens in a split second, and then watch as the rest of the day unfolds. It's horror in the mundane and the panicked secrecy of what happened, and it's a really hard watch. So much so, in fact, that after watching it for the first time, I told myself I would never watch it again. I was angry at the people who made it, and I was angry at Alex from Beyond the Void Horror podcast for recommending it to me. So I called him right away, and we talked about it. And as I talked about the movie and began to cool off, I started to get upset for another reason. The Coffee Table is a very, very well-made movie, and when I realized that, my heart began to sink because I knew it was going to be another one of those situations where it would just linger in the back of my head. These ultra-disturbing movies are oftentimes easy to disregard because they're trying way too hard to be edgy and in the process forget to make an actual movie, but this one doesn't grant you that. And by the end of our conversation, I was pissed that it was actually well made. Show some love to my boy Alex, by the way. That dude makes some fantastic videos and has seen more movies than I think anyone else I know. Now, this movie is pitched as a very dark comedy, and the first go around, I had absolutely no idea where the hell the humor was supposed to be. It wasn't until I decided I was going to make this video and begrudgingly rewatch the movie that I saw the humorous side of The Coffee Table, which is pretty much entirely tied into the irony of the dialogue. I did chuckle a couple of times on my second viewing, which surprised me because I was nothing but upset the first time, but you're gonna have to embrace the darkest pits of your humor if you want to tap into that side of things. I'm gonna warn you now before I get into it, this movie is extremely disturbing and completely ruined my day. And I thought I'd be fine the second go around, but I absolutely wasn't. I was on the brink of a panic attack for the last 10 minutes the first time I saw the movie, so I just want to be very clear about that before giving this thing its flowers that I wish it didn't deserve.
Ay, me encantaría ver qué cara se te ha puesto. Ay.
Hey, so remember that intro where I talked about how disturbing this movie is? The whole thing was a lie. The Coffee Table opens with the wonder of childbirth and an overjoyed mother seeing her baby for the first time, which she later says was a moment unlike any other, where the love she felt for her baby was instantly more intense than any she had felt before. It's truly beautiful. The only stain on the lives of this happily married couple is that Jesus has absolutely horrendous taste in furniture. I'm lying. I wish I could just be silly like this for the whole video to help me cope my way through talking about this thing. But the reality is that there actually is a lot of really interesting material to talk about here, and I can't pretend anymore. This movie is essentially designed to be an hour and a half of psychological torment, and one of the ways that it loves to do that is by really focusing on how happy Maria is to finally have a child. We learn that her and Jesus have been trying for a long time. She's undergone 2 years of treatment to help her along the way in getting pregnant, and this is finally her being able to fulfill experiencing the thing that she credits with making existence worth it.
Merece la pena existir solo por sentir todo lo que siento por él.
The other thing that they focus on establishing is the tension between Maria and Jesus, because while she's been very focused on getting to this point in their lives, he seems to not have been quite as keen on the idea of having a baby, and so now they're in this position where they're bickering a lot over the decisions that are made in their relationship. I'm not sure why he wouldn't air these grievances during the 2 years that she was undergoing treatment for this, but We don't see any of that stage of their relationship, and there isn't much information given there, so I don't want to make any assumptions about the dynamic. It's really not the point of the movie anyway. What matters is that Jesus feels like he doesn't have any agency in his life at this point, and so they agree that he can choose the coffee table that they'll get for their place. The salesman who sells them the table is the most outwardly humorous part of the movie. He's a very stereotypical sleazy salesman who makes impossible claims and talks about how this is the best thing you're gonna get. But he doesn't have one himself, of course. At least he is honest with Jesus after Maria leaves, though.
Pero así entre usted y yo, sinceramente, ¿le gusta la mesita?
No.
Maria really hates the table, and she should, but they did agree that Jesus could pick it, and this is one of those moments that shows early on that this is actually a quite well thought out script. It's certainly possible that I'm imposing my own tastes here, but this table is so fucking ugly that part of me thinks Jesus literally only bought it out of spite because Maria hated it so much. This is the most gaudy looking piece of shit I've ever seen. It doesn't even remotely fit anything else in their flat, and it's clearly being oversold by someone who had it in their warehouse for way too long because nobody wants it, and he's trying to offload it as quickly as possible. It's such a clear red flag, but Jesus still goes for it even after the salesman admits what he actually thinks, so it seems to me that his sole reason for buying it was so that Maria would have to see something in the middle of the living room every day that she absolutely hated. There is a lot of really great stuff here, one of the big ones being how when the salesman is trying to strengthen his pitch, he says that the glass is unbreakable and talks about things that can break. And when he mentions a marriage, we see the reflection of Jesus and Maria in the glass on the table, which is a fucking fantastic bit of visual storytelling because, of course, this dude is full of shit and the glass can break, so this is foreshadowing how their lives are about to shatter when they bring this thing into their home. It's also the first scene where we get a hint at the approach to humor here, which is very focused on irony or things along that line.
Y les aseguro que esta mesa, por diseño y por su nivel, les va a cambiar la vida a mejor. Les va a aportar felicidad al hogar.
Beg to differ. The other thing that's set up before, we'll get to that, is a young neighbor who is absolutely in love with Jesus and is convinced that he loves her too and just won't admit it. Now this is a really weird plot point and it can feel sort of peripheral to a story that is otherwise completely zeroed in on its concept. But don't worry, it exists entirely to add more stress, misery, and trauma into the final act. That is literally the entire reason it's here, so we'll talk more about it when we get to the ending. Okay, I guess I can't delay any longer. It's time to get to the catalytic event that sets the stage for the rest of this lovely day. After bickering back and forth for a while, Maria goes to run out to the store to pick up some food and drink because Jesus' brother is coming later that day with his new girlfriend, and while she's out, Jesus is hanging with Cayetano, trying to help him stop crying, but he's just being a dick about it.
¿Qué pasa? ¿Por qué llora así? Ay, ay, ay. Que le han puesto un nombre muy feo y por eso llora.
I don't know if Jesus is a fucking terrible asshole or if the day we see him on is just a particularly bad one, but this dude just cannot stop. The naming of their child is once again something that's meant to show how he feels like he's not given any control over his life, and that's meant to really elevate the misery when the one thing he does choose winds up doing this. At least he stopped crying. Yeah, this is a batshit insane moment, and it comes only 20 minutes into the movie. I knew absolutely nothing going in aside from Alex telling me that it was extremely disturbing, and you're gonna know pretty quickly if this is something that you want to stick around for. Obviously, you know that something is going to go wrong, and I think the assumption for a setup like this, at least for me, is that the table is gonna have a curse on it and bring some evil entity into their home, or it's gonna be like a No Country for Old Men scenario where it's actually stolen and then some bad people come after it. But this is not that kind of movie. There is nothing supernatural here. You don't see a single death in the entire movie. It's all just torture having to sit through the hours following something like this. The moment itself is an absolute gut punch, obviously because of the subject matter of what just happened, where it's placed in the movie so early on, and also because of how well they use sound to tell you what happened, instead of relying on showing the visual of it, which would probably make this feel a lot more edgelordy and uninteresting. The immediate cessation of the baby's cries after you hear the glass shatter, the utter silence from Jesus, and the way the music just carries on like nothing happened is an absolutely haunting way to start things off. They really hold on Jesus's stunned panic as his brain pushes back what just happened, cutting back and forth between Maria at the store, all happy-go-lucky, talking to her friend about how over the moon she is to finally be a mother, and then to Jesus just frozen in the moment. It's obviously a very upsetting sequence, and they do a good job of contrasting the feeling of something very mundane and everyday, like talking to your friend at the store, with the world-shattering nightmare that Jesus has just found himself in. I do really appreciate how well this movie plays with that sort of thing, you know, contrasting normalcy with an upended life. It's all made so much worse when Maria puts Jesus on the phone with her friend, who begins asking gleefully how Jesus is enjoying being a father. Torment. That's what this whole movie is. Jesus hangs up, and when Maria calls back, she asks, "Did it cut off?" Cheeky fucking writers, man. I want to go through and look at some of the examples of the humor because I was so upset by this movie the first go around that I didn't even notice them or register them as humor. One comes here when there's an announcement on the store loudspeaker advertising where to find super absorbent towels. If you're gonna watch this movie and you find yourself having a hard time with it, I recommend trying to pay attention to that sort of thing to help pull you through, because as much as I hate to say it, there are a few things that made me laugh on my second watch. Maria, you might want to pick some of those up. When Jesus' brother arrives with his girlfriend, she's wearing this bright pink cheery shirt that says "No bad days." And honestly, I would probably kill her right then and there if this was me. They make sure to get really close up on a bottle of red wine being popped open and poured into a glass, which Jesus is clearly not loving drinking because of what that visual is probably reminding him of. And this is one of those things where I did notice the parallel with what happened to Cayetano, but I found it more torturous than funny. Perhaps the most uncomfortable example of this sort of thing is when Maria returns home and Jesus is desperately trying to cover things up, so he says he broke the table and cut his hand on the glass, and Cayetano is sleeping in his crib, but it took a lot to get him down, so she doesn't go check on him. Because she hated that ugly fucking table and the salesman really pushed that it was completely unbreakable, Maria just starts cackling at the irony of the situation.
Gracias.
The life savings spent on cigarettes makes it sound like it's taunting Jesus intentionally, and as she laughs, she keeps saying things like, "I would have loved to see the moment it broke," or "I'd give anything to have seen it." Anything? That's the thing here. You need to be able to tap into a side of yourself that can find humor in the utmost misfortune of this fella, with moments like this when his brother jokingly punches him with a Hulk glove, which probably felt like getting hit by a freight train in the state that he's in. I would certainly not go so far as to say that this is a funny movie, but I did find myself appreciating the ironic double entendres that they made use of. It's a fun part of the script that makes you want to really pay attention to what's being said, and with a movie that doesn't expand much beyond its premise, those kinds of things are very important for keeping it interesting. The only thing that is outwardly funny to me is the salesman, because the scene where they buy the table isn't the last that we see of him. While Jesus is setting it up, he notices that there's a screw missing that's important for holding on the glass, and so he calls them to bring it to him, and the salesman delivers it himself. By the way, his name is also Cayetano. There's something that seems to be a constant through line in this movie. Everyone wants to fuck Jesus. That weird neighbor seems to believe they're destined lovers, and this dude also seems to be pretty into him. He's played by Eduardo Antuna, and this dude does such a good job of playing this sort of lonely, desperate guy who really wants to win over Jesus and make a friend out of him. Or something more, it's a little ambiguous.
Me ha caído muy bien. No sé, yo creo que tenemos, no sé, feeling.
He brings along a contest form for him to potentially win a luxury fan, but I have a feeling that Jesus really isn't in the market for anything with blades on it at the moment. I think Jesus would probably rival a Terrifier movie if he got his hands on a fan. What I really like though is this moment where Cayetano hands him the screw that was missing, and we get this close-up shot of it before Jesus quickly pockets it, like he can't bear to look at the thing. We don't know exactly what happened to cause the accident since it was off screen, but we do know that the table wasn't fully secured because it was missing this apparently essential screw. So Jesus seeing this little thing is yet another taunting piece of reality saying that something so insignificant as a little screw played a part in utterly destroying his life. There's something that I've always found to be one of the most effective points of focus when you want to make a scene disturbing, and that's not to focus on the graphic nature of what happened, but instead the denial of reality and the panicked realization that comes when someone has a split-second moment that changes everything for them. It's easy to make something disturbing if you focus on just showing the most fucked up shit you possibly can, but the coffee table takes an entirely different approach and decides to see what happens if you're forced to sit in the hours following something like this, and that concept alone is something that I find to be a really interesting angle. Once Jesus is finally able to rip himself out of the initial realization, we see him sort of robotically going through the motions of things that show him trying to hold on to the now long gone sense of normalcy. Like, his mind thinks that he can maybe manifest the world back to the way it was if he carries on doing as he otherwise would. The most upsetting example of this is when he changes Cayetano's diaper. We've seen that Jesus has been very combative with Maria surrounding the child, and just a moment before everything fell apart, he was talking about how awful the name that Maria chose is, and you can feel here how he's just desperately trying to make up for how he's been acting by trying to care for Cayetano. And now we're frozen in time here, waiting to see what the hell he's going to do, because Maria is coming home soon. And here's another example of this movie showing a pretty honest reflection of the flawed way that the human mind can work when in such a panicked and surreal state. Obviously, there's no way to hide this. A headless baby is something that is generally noticed for those who look at said baby, and it's fairly likely that Maria will, at some point in the future, want to look at her baby and would more than likely notice the absence of a fairly important asset. She is going to find out, it is going to be discovered, and yet Jesus decides to try and cover it up anyway, doing his best to clean things up and putting the now slightly less heavy Cayetano into his crib. Not the ideal weight loss program, but it'll do in a jiffy. He's really not thinking here, it's just his brain taking over control and running on autopilot to try and delay the inevitable and hide from what happened. There's no thought put into the fact that by the end of the day, Maria will absolutely know. All that matters is that she doesn't know the moment she gets home, because in a traumatic situation like this, there often isn't much awareness of the fact that anything exists beyond the standing moment. His world has ended, so to him, now is the only real thing, so he's trying to make now look as inconspicuous as possible. Now, overall, this is a well-crafted movie, but there is one moment where my ability to suspend disbelief is stretched a bit too far, and it takes me out of the otherwise very realistic presentation. Jesus is needing to clean up as much of the blood as he can, but he doesn't have the supplies that he needs, so like he's baking a cake and needs to borrow a cup of flour, he goes to that batshit neighbor's place and asks for supplies. Here's the issue that I have with this. Yes, this movie has some cartoony characters and sillier moments, but the staining on his shirt absolutely could not pass for red paint. And if someone shows up at your door looking like this and asking for those kinds of supplies, all I can say is that if you often find yourself needing to get away with murder, move into this apartment building because the tenants are beautifully oblivious. It's the only moment of the movie where I felt like it went too far with the silliness and took me out of things. Otherwise though, this whole section of the movie is really well done. Once Maria gets home, the remainder of the movie is just this sickening, tension-filled dread fest that is the definition of a nail biter, because of how potent that feeling of a ticking time bomb is. All of these little things keep happening, like Maria almost going into the room when she hears dripping on the baby monitor and Jesus has to quickly step in to make sure she doesn't go because he knows what that dripping is. Or when Jesus's brother and his girlfriend want to say hi to the baby and give him presents. It's a really unique use of tension because it's not like we're on the edge of our seats waiting for some big scare to come. It's just this knife's edge of panic watching as people come so close to seeing something that will shred their world into pieces. Of course, on top of how tense it is, it's also insanely tragic and upsetting. What I really appreciate about the way that this is displayed is that it's not just a bunch of scenes of him looking sad or acting like he's hiding something. They do a really good job of showing how utterly overwhelmed his nervous system is and how everything in the world has transformed into a disgusting reminder of what happened. The wine feels like drinking blood. The food that Maria cooked he can only see as bits of raw meat or like he's chewing on broken bloody glass. The sounds of knives and forks are blisteringly loud and dizzying. Looking around the dinner table at his family eating is like a high-octane action movie because of how amped up and disconnected his mind is. It's a very good way of reflecting the state of mind you'd probably be in this situation. And I don't know if I ever needed that realistically recreated. I'm just being honest. As this grueling runtime draws to a close, you know, any minute now, the discovery is going to be made, and this is honestly the thing that could make or break the entire movie. Jesus winds up needing to leave the table because he's so overwhelmed, and his brother overhears him leaving a goodbye message for Maria, talking about how he can't face her and see the truth that he's been hiding all day destroy her.
No tengo el valor para decirte a la cara esto y ver cómo lloras sin consuelo por mi culpa.
It's a really fucking tragic and upsetting scene because the things he's saying, it feels just way too real. The way he words this message feels like someone who's been confronted with such a distorted reality and simply cannot go through seeing what his wife will be like when she finds out. He begs to be forgiven, he apologizes over and over again for ruining her life and leaving her to deal with it on her own. It's really tough to get through. Because he was overheard, his brother now knows why he's been acting so strangely all day and feels that he needs to see Cayetano to believe what Jesus is telling him. Now this next little while almost pushed me to my limit. I think it is the closest I've ever been to tapping out of a movie in my adult life because the sense of dreadful panic is way too palpable. Carlos and Jesus sit in the room for a while talking over the situation, and Carlos desperately wants to find a way to make sure that Maria doesn't see her baby, although he's well aware they've got only about 10 minutes before she does because she has to feed him. Now, the thing that I haven't really talked about much is that while Cayetano's body is in his crib, his head is not. It rolled under a chair when the accident happened and Jesus couldn't bring himself to move it. This is where the movie builds itself up to a crescendo where all of the dread, tragedy, and horridness of this story all come together, with Carlos and Jesus going out to tell Maria about what happened, the next door neighbor arriving to tell Maria that her and Jesus are in love, and she brings her dog along who starts sniffing under the chair. Carlos, knowing what's under there now, goes and grabs it and tries to hide it from Maria, begging her to leave because while the discovery is unavoidable, he doesn't want her to see it. It's like, I guess shattering. It's a shattering sequence that pushes the sense of panic to its absolute limit, with Maria realizing that something is terribly wrong. Carlos doing his damn best to protect her from what he's holding in his arms, Jesus breaking down on the other side of the room and becoming catatonic, unable to come any closer, and while it all happens, we also have the neighbor implying that Jesus is a PDF file. I hate having to do that, by the way. I know that you hate hearing it. I hate saying it even more, but I have to abide. This is what I meant when I said the entire point of her inclusion was to make the movie even more miserable. It literally just feels like it was added for another layer of confusion and dread in the climax, and it also allowed the director to have a child be absolutely traumatized when she sees what's in Carlos's hands. It's just sensory overload with dizzying camera work and people talking over each other and Christina throwing up. Now, I will say, one thing that I find to be an interesting idea is that Maria knew pretty much as soon as she got home that something was wrong. Her laughter is so over the top and goes on for so long that it becomes cartoonish, which isn't necessarily out of line with the way that this movie likes to handle its tormenting humor, but it does raise an interesting perspective that throughout the entire movie, she knows that something happened with Cayetano, but her mind is absolutely unwilling to face the reality of that. The reason that I feel like it's possible is because her reaction at the end here feels less like someone being blindsided by this sort of realization and more like someone being forced to face a fact that they've been hiding from. Her behavior sometimes seems like there's an underlying terror that if she even somewhat acknowledges or allows herself to suspect that something is wrong, that it'll become a reality, so she just carries on as if she doesn't have any inkling. I'm not certain about this, but I do find it to be an interesting way of looking at the movie and adds another human layer to her character. Before we get to the ending, I need to praise the actors in this movie because the performances here are honestly staggeringly good. David Perea, in the lead role as Jesus, nails everything the character asks of him, from the sort of spiteful, sarcastic guy we see at the beginning of the movie to the absolutely broken man that we see for the majority of it. The scene where he stops Maria and talks to her about how much she means to him and how sorry he is for behaving the way he has is heartbreaking, because you can see how he's trying to hold on to whatever he can and naively feeling that perhaps if he can be sweet and kind like this, he can fix it all. But of course, he knows that's not possible, and the hopelessness here is tangible. It also really sucks that this is what it took for him to have that moment with Maria. Estefania de los Santos as Maria also plays her character perfectly, and maybe the highlight of the whole movie, if I'm being honest. I've tried to do about 7 takes of this name, and I'm trying to do it in my best Spanish accent, but I can't do it, so I'm sorry. Josep Maria Riera as Carlos really shines during that last section once he finds out what's going on, especially during the moment where he's trying to protect Maria from seeing what happened, but knowing that she will eventually find out about it. Claudia Riera as Cristina doesn't stand out as much, but her role does serve its purpose of showing the contrasting situation where Jesus and Maria have just lost their child, while Carlos and Cristina make the announcement that they're having a baby. Her character is quite a bit younger than the others, and there's a good generational contrast that she brings. The performances all around are really fantastic, which is great for the movie, of course, but it kind of sucks because it can make certain moments feel way too real. I don't think I ever wanted this situation portrayed in such an honest way. Thank you very much. I will say, at least after all of this, there's an ending that's about as happy as you can get from this situation. When Maria finds out what happened, of course, she's broken, but we skip many months ahead and find that this absolute tragedy that occurred actually led to Jesus and Maria becoming closer as they bonded in the horror of it all, and they've got another child on the way. Kidding, of course, they both throw themselves off the balcony, Maria doing so while holding Cayetano's head. Cristina goes to a hospital, the neighbor has a massive panic attack, and Carlos is left utterly traumatized and in shock, with the only thing he's able to say being the coffee table. It's fucking cheery, isn't it? I think if you're gonna talk about disturbing movies that have come out in the last few years, this is one that absolutely deserves to be in the conversation as one of the better ones, because it focuses on actually crafting a psychological story rather than an overly graphic one. It's very well executed, the actors are fantastic, and it achieves its goals wonderfully, and I hate that. Here's the thing though, for me, if I'm gonna sit through something this grueling and upsetting, I want some sort of takeaway that gives the experience more of a purpose than just how disturbing it is. I love confrontational stories, but I find myself wanting a bit more of a purpose to sitting down and watching something like this, beyond just going through psychological torment for an hour and a half, regardless of how well it's done. Speak No Evil, for example, while very upsetting, at least has that core theme of needing to be able to draw your boundaries and enforce them. Be willing to step up and stand your ground because there are people who will take advantage of those who let them. Since making that video, I've gotten tons of comments of people saying how unrealistic the characters in Speak No Evil are. I can tell you, those characters are not unrealistic. Some people freeze in moments like that, and I found that commentary in Speak No Evil to be really effective. Cannibal Holocaust, while it absolutely has some of that edgelord mentality and isn't actually a great exploration of the stuff that it explores, touches on how monstrous our quote-unquote civilized society is and how we treat less developed cultures as lesser while we commit atrocious acts. The message in The Coffee Table is, don't decapitate your baby with an ugly table. Which is definitely a good thing to try and keep in mind on a day-to-day basis, I suppose, but it's not enough substance for this movie to be something that I can actually say I love. To be very clear, I would take The Coffee Table over Cannibal Holocaust any day of the week, and I think it's a much better movie. It's an endurance test sort of just for the sake of being one, but it's done in a much better way than a lot of movies where the entire point is to put the viewer through hell, and a lot of the humor does land. And I will say that as I've been working on this video, The Coffee Table is starting to grow on me a lot more. There's just so much to chew on in this script beyond the surface level dread of the situation. The characters are so well realized and brought to life vividly by this great cast, and the humor is something I'm appreciating more and more. It's also shot with this wonderful competence in how to tell your story through visuals and an artistic eye that shines through. It's a great movie, it's just not one that I'll find myself wanting to revisit all that often because it's so grueling and cruel. I'm very conflicted on it because there is something compelling about that, and I have a lot of respect for what they brought to the table here. I haven't really covered many disturbing movies on the channel, so I guess let me know if this is something you want to see more of. As for me, I'm gonna go sit in the sunlight now and look at the pretty flowers because I need to feel better. Fuck. Thanks for watching through to the end. I hope you enjoyed the video enough that you want to see more, and if that's the case, consider subscribing and hitting the notification bell because YouTube can sometimes suck at recommending channels. A huge thank you to my wonderful Patreon supporters and YouTube channel members who are a massive help in allowing me to continue committing as much time as I can to making these videos. If you want to gain access to things like behind the scenes material or gain early access to my videos, consider supporting me on either platform. As always, thank you for stopping by Rocklin Graves. I hope you've enjoyed your stay.